is just a quick picture. Um, Obviously, you can see that over the years to the present, the production is dominated by coal, um, uh, then oil, going bottom to top, um, and um, nuclear, natural gas, and renewables is a tiny, tiny, tiny little thing at the top with wind and solar. So just for some perspective, because I'm going to get into what the grid actually has to do with all of this. So what the grid has to do with this is what our grid looked like uh, in November of 21. Doesn't matter. It's 5 days. So notice the variability of power production, up, down, up, down, up, down. And these little lines at the bottom that go, little bumps are solar. The ones right above it are wind. And you'll notice the ripples that they create. They go up, they go down, they go up, they go down. Where solar does it every day, wind started at the beginning of the week near the 100 mark, and it finished the week at half that. Okay, so now I'm going to show you it from a different picture. This is exactly the same chart except turned the other way. So at the bottom, we have nuclear, then we have coal, then we have natural gas. I don't know why I got the wrong chart. There's one with hydro, but it doesn't matter. Notice the nuclear and coal lines, hydro would be the same, or straight lines. Then notice natural gas has variability to it. And it's those bumps from renewables. So the gap to total power, and I see where the hydro went. Anyway, is this up and down aspect is completely generated by the alternatives. It's generated by the variability of wind, the variability of solar. So what I like to say is if you want to get rid of, for instance, coal or natural gas, you have to push down into the stack. You start at the top and push your way down. Well, if you're going to start with renewables, and I'll go back to here, those are those lines at the bottom, not insignificant, but you can only have so much impact because the grid does not have a system of balancing the power production and the power use. So this is where we're going to go into. This is what Hank's going to talk about. And Stephen's got examples of projects, and I'll talk about other variability and things like that. So essentially, that's what is today, what's going on, and the limitations of doing that. So if I go back to here, what we're talking about obviously is the ability to replace one thing with another. Here is a system by which, and this is from a deal I worked on in Taiwan, so this is real. Essentially, the sell side are wind producers. They sell into essentially a marketplace. They cannot sell to power users. The power users, all the way on the right, buy from the market. And what that means is in the middle, there is a trading place whereby storage systems, grid storage, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end after Hank talks. But grid storage is a prerequisite for us to push down into that stack. Without being able to stabilize wind, stabilize solar, it's impossible to push down into that. So bear with me for, I'm going to do 2 minutes of electricity 101. I apologize for that aspect of it. Sorry. Trying to get rid of my PowerPoint. So essentially, the grid um, ends at your house. That's 220 volts. It comes off a wire, goes into your house. That same electricity starts somewhere at a transformer, at a power plant, hydro, coal, wherever it starts. Then it has to get to you. The electricity 101 is that the farther you send electricity, the more you lose. So you start with X amount and then you start losing power as you get to the other end. The inverse is that the voltage uh, is lower, you lose more. As the voltage climbs, you move high. Stephen talked about high voltage going from 15 to 21 billion investments. So I want to talk about that for a second. So those big old power lines that you see running are the very, very high voltage lines. Then there's transformers that step it down to get to a transformer near your house that steps it down and gets it to 220 volts. We also have, and keep this one in mind, ultra high voltage lines. Now, everything I've said so far is AC, alternating current. And now we're going to talk about DC for just 30 seconds. The very big projects that now want to send power a long way, the only way to do it is by high voltage DC, not AC. So they're very high voltage lines, they're direct current, and they run a long way because they lose the least amount of energy. As an example, there's a project being built in Wyoming, $5 billion wind project, and I use the power in Wyoming. They're going to run a high voltage DC to Los Angeles. The high voltage DC line itself costs $3 billion. So, so that is a bit of old school thinking. It's a bit of we're going to build a grid and just run everything to where the power units are. So a lot of what we've been talking about at 361, and we're going to talk a bit about today, is the opposite of that. And Hanks is the extreme example, whereby the grid of the future isn't centralized, it's decentralized. It's mini grids, and Stephen's going to talk about companies that want their own power sources. I will talk about co-location. Hank's going to talk about literally the end user storing their own power. So that's it in a nutshell. Um, Before I go on, I'm just going to stop for 2 seconds and see if there's any questions just about the big picture, grid, electricity, in case there's any confusion. Yes, no? Okay. Anyway, let's go on. So, Stephen, are you there? Unmute yourself.
I am unmuted.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Andrew. So this is just, I've been in the project financing side for about 3 years now, so I'm relatively new to the game. I have come across a number of privately funded, privately sponsored projects that essentially want to build what I call power plants, whether they're based on renewable, which they usually are, and usually that means solar. The majority of them are solar, but there's some geothermal, there's some tidal projects, especially in the Caribbean, that I've come across. And if, there's some wind, but I've not seen a lot of wind. Is very difficult because it's the least reliable source. It's highly dependent on regions. So what I've put on the screen here, and that's my soul slide, is just a few examples of projects that I'm involved with right now. And that I have more, but it'll give you an idea of, and it's all over the world, in relative places around the world. And then I'm not going to read through all of this, but the conclusion here is that there's a lot of interest by fabricators, manufacturers to have their own power plant rather than rely on the grid for a variety of reasons. In the West, it's usually a question of cost. In other regions of the world, it's usually a question of lack of grid, lack of access to a reliable grid. So it's easier to just build your old plant and go with it. And in some areas that are a mix of both, such as Mexico, you'll have projects that go up, big projects, because land is cheap. So they'll build it there, somewhere in the desert and somewhere in wide, vast open spaces. And they still have the ability to offload their excess production into whatever local grid there is. Oh, I didn't
Sorry.
touch this.
No, it's my fault. My fault. Sorry, I accidentally touched it.
Okay, so and they range in size. It's usually measured in megawatts. Below this, I mean, even 3 megawatts is there's such a thing as minimum scale before it's economically viable. And my anecdotal evidence is that anything below 20 or anything below 10 megawatt doesn't seem to have a lot of traction. I've not seen any project that is that small, but it goes up from there into the hundreds of megawatts. Solar panels are the easiest. The more land you have, the more power you can produce. It's that simple. It's a linear relationship. You want double the power, you double the panels. So it's very
Hey,
easy.
Stephen, can I interrupt for a second? Because each of your
Sure.
things has megawatts literally on each of these examples. So
Yeah.
whether you have 150 geothermal or 200 solar plant, just give us context. What does 200 megawatts do? I think people have trouble, doing the math. You know what I mean? What's 200
Okay.
megawatts give us?
The easiest to imagine, take the one in Uganda at the top there. It says 6.5 megawatt solar and 2 megawatts.
In the center.
This is to power a cement production plant. So it's a relatively, I would say it's an industrial size, industrial scale plant, nothing enormously big. If you had like a shopping center would probably consume 1 or 2 megawatts just in electricity and air conditioning. Let me see here. I mean, that's the example I can give you. Your house only consumes kilowatts 1,000 times less. So the biggest consumer of power is usually electric motors in plants, in industrial plants, and air conditioning. Those two together consume probably 80% of the manufacturing facility's power requirements, unless you're dealing with computers and data centers. And I have an example here on the top right there, which is going to go up in 2024 in California, and that's just one of many. Data centers are enormously hungry for power, and it all goes into cooling the chips. All this electricity goes in to eliminate the heat that's produced by the chips as they're working. And data centers are a huge consumer of these things. Cryptocurrency mining operations are enormously hungry for power as well, for the same reason. It all gets rid of heat, which is kind of a shame when you think of it. It's an enormously wasteful way of doing business, but that's what it is. If you're going to deal with a hydroelectric plant or a nuclear plant, you're usually dealing in gigawatts, so it's 1,000 times higher than the megawatt. But that's state level or that's municipality level power requirements. So there's a smattering of projects here. So in every case, there's a desire to produce power locally and as close as the end user as possible. A lot of these projects will produce a power by one party and is being bought by the end user who's set up at the production plant. I call it production plant. It could be a plant for anything. So the offtake is bought by a second party, which is typically private. So that's the unique thing. It's a private producer selling to a private user. The example in California with this one is for specifically for a data center. So it's all of it will be taken up by the company that's going to be running these centers. There's a desire to expand this. They're going all over the map, by the way, in the US. There's a huge demand for privately produced power to supply data centers. And you can think of Amazon, the big ones, Amazon, Google, even Facebook.
So Stephen, what type of projects, shortlist, would, for instance, be built to do this?
The easiest is solar plants, by far, because all you need is land. Solar panels are very inefficient compared to everything else. So what you need, you need to make it up in surface area of exposure. So in areas that are slightly populated, it makes a whole lot of sense to take up land that's not used for agriculture and just throw it up. And most of the projects that I've seen in the US that are so-called renewable energy projects are all solar panels, except a couple that are looking for so-called molten salt nuclear reactors, small-scale molten salts, which is a different way of producing power from uranium without having fission. So but they're still very expensive.
Yeah,
to build.
We did something on that. In fact, they're small modular reactors, a couple in Ontario being built, Poland, but that's coming. I think today we're going to stick to whatever we can do now.
Yeah, so that's what it is. It's solar is good. It's not good for all over the world. I mean, solar, at the equator, you have the maximum amount of energy you can extract from a solar panel. And as you move away from the equator, you decrease the amount of power you can produce. If you do it like you put a solar panel in Chicago, and it's about, if I remember correctly, it's about 2.5 times less productive than the same solar panel in California. And it has to do with latitude. That's all it is. It's the angle that the solar rays form, the angle at which they hit the Earth. So it's crazy. So you need to be closer. I always say between the two tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, that's your Goldilocks zone.
Stephen, it's on a daily basis. It's called one sun is the best time to generate solar power. It's called one sun from about 11 to 2.
You can actually look up, there's an index. So the Northeast where I was 2.2, Southern California is 4.5. Do the math. Steven's got it about right.
Yeah, it's both right. It's both 2. Yeah. So, but the issue of renewable power, when it's either solar, wind, even, I mean, I got a project here on geothermal, and any other, or tidal waves, which is another one. Another one is waste to energy, where you literally take a municipal garbage, burn it, and then drive a steam turbine. There's an example like this at the bottom of the slide there in Sao Paulo. All of these renewable projects have to have a storage component, which relies on current state technology for batteries, basically a battery. And Andrew and I discussed this last week. The current state of battery technology is very inefficient. You require an enormous amount of space once again, just to store this stuff, and then it's inefficient when you retrieve it. So
Hey, Stephen.
Yes?
I'll tell you what, because part of Hank's going to talk about batteries, so
okay.
I would actually
I'll leave it
love
at that.
No. I was about to say it's a perfect topic, and I'm all over it. But I think if we let Hank go through,
yes,
and then the 3 of us can revisit it after he talks. it's going to be a lot more efficient.
Yeah.
So,
So I'll conclude with two
I'm
comments.
sorry.
If I can just
Go ahead.
conclude.
No,
Is
absolutely. Absolutely.
what's that? No, no,
No, go
I'm
ahead.
pretty well.
Go
I
ahead.
was just an example. So the three lessons are private power selling to private buyers, which is new in the we always connect to the grid, typically in North America, even the West in Europe. That's number one. Number two is it's always localized. They don't want to connect to a long grid. And number three, it will be connected to a grid only if the utility is willing to pay for it to get the connection. Otherwise, it makes a project uneconomical. Final comment: there is not enough copper reserves in the world to electrify all of the cars on the planet. And that's excluding transmission, that's excluding production, that's excluding any other application of copper in motors. So that is a known fact. There is not enough copper to do this. So to electrify the entire world away from everything else, even if you could produce the electricity, you can't consume it. Number two, whatever budget you're not spending on oil and gas and coal exploration and exploitation, you're going to have to put it in multiple times into mining, because all renewables increase the amount of mining you need to do worldwide to get your raw materials, and that's an element that's never considered by most people, and it's highly damaging to the environment. That's it.
Okay, we'll be back, Stephen.
Yeah, I know.
Hank,
I'll just go mute again.
I just pulled. No. We're all good. We're all good. We're actually right on time. So Hank, I just pulled a couple of slides from your deck. Not necessarily that what you want to speak about. So you've got your solar installations, and here there's your battery storage volumes. So go ahead, and I'll just flip these around as you speak.
All right. Okay. So my background is not in any of these fields. I came into this about 15 years ago when I found my mission to end the use of carbon-based fuel. And I started in Hawaii, and Hawaii at the time spent $5 billion a year on oil and $1 billion in coal. And that's 1.5 million people plus tourists. So you can imagine how much of a drain on the economy that was, and still continues to be. We finally passed a law in Hawaii that says Hawaii has to go 100% renewable by 2045. And so, and we changed the business model of the utility so they make more money by switching to renewables. And that caused all kinds of things to, how can I say, to creak at the edges. One of the things that we did was we passed a law that helped the solar industry. And as a result, we ended up, we predicted there was going to be 30 megawatts. Here we go with the megawatts again. 30 megawatts of rooftop solar. That means independent, like home solar. And we ended up with 300 megawatts. And then the utility said, whoa, we can't handle that much renewable or that much variable energy on the grid, which is true. There's a limit as to how much they can actually handle on the grid. And then they started, in their power purchase agreements, they started having provisions which allow them to curtail. In other words, when there's too much electricity on the grid, they say, don't give it to me, just ground it. And so again, with a utility that's spending, or a jurisdiction that's spending $3 billion a year on fossil fuel, how is it that we're grounding electricity when there's too much of it? And that's just because the grid is set up the old way, as somebody mentioned earlier. That we have a couple of power plants that power all of Oahu, for example. One was coal, and one is actually crude oil. And wires from those two locations go through the island and feed everybody the electricity that they're looking for. And so then when we put solar in different places and feed back into the grid, it causes problems, or it's causing problems. And I would say that has to do with, how can I say, with the fact that the grid is old and it was built in a time when monolithic generation plants were the standard fare. The future is multiple, because now we're getting renewable energy being fed into the grid from many places. And that's causing the utility to have to think about it differently from the old way. I have a little personal experience in that I have when we reached the point in Hawaii where the utility said we can't connect any more rooftop solar to the grid, it's too much. For example, my house in Honolulu, I want to put solar panels on my roof. And they said, no, you can't, because there are already too many people in your neighborhood that have solar. And I look at my neighborhood and yes, I see solar, but it's not like 50%. It's like, I don't know, maybe 15% or something like that. In any case, I thought about this and I came to the realization that we're going to need storage to store the solar when there's too much of it. And so I decided to do a little bit of a test. And I took my ranch on the Big Island off grid. We've been living off grid for, 9 years now. We spent a year, well, you don't need to know the details of the story, but suffice to say, we do it all with solar. And the problem with solar is that it only happens in the daytime. So then we need the storage to get us through the night, and that turns into being batteries. So we have about, I don't know, I guess we have about 150 kilowatts of peak power from all the solar we have at the ranch. And we have about 200 and a little over 200 kilowatt hours of storage, of battery storage. So, but still, we can't store all of oh, by the way, we had to build it so that it works on a cloudy day. And so what happens is on a sunny day, we have all kinds of extra energy. And what we do is we use the extra energy on the sunny days to make hydrogen. So that if, for example, all of the solar that's being curtailed in Hawaii went to producing hydrogen, then that hydrogen could be used for transportation or turned back into electricity. But getting back to it, Hawaii is sort of a microcosm of what's going to happen everywhere. So what happened in the beginning, we are happy to have renewable energy on the grid, variable, and it didn't have that much of an effect. But when it started to have an effect, all the new PPAs include storage. Now, the economics of this is that the utility spends 25 cents per kilowatt hour on oil-based electricity. Wind and solar come in at 8 cents. And if you add storage, it's up to 12 cents. That's still half the cost. So the story about wind and solar, how can I say, being a problem can be solved by having storage. Now, there's multiple ways of storing electricity. You can store it, of course, in batteries, which is the most expensive way of storing electricity. You can store it in the form of hydrogen, which is less so, but we don't have the infrastructure yet to handle that. You can even on a grid scale store it as pumped hydro. You can pump water uphill, and then when you need it at night, you can let it flow downhill. Unfortunately, Hawaii had a dam failure on private property, and as a result, Hawaii's become allergic to dams. All of the water behind the existing dams has been let go, and so now we don't have that as an option. And that's just a political thing because it's stupid. They should figure out how to inspect dams and make sure that they're okay and use that. So I've got my ranch experience, and then the island experience follows. Hawaii is, and the nice thing about Hawaii is that there's multiple islands. So each island has its own population problem, its own generation problem. And so they're all different. And rather than cabling them all together, which was a conversation that we had, where I think I'm in favor of watching each island solve its own problem differently, then we get lots of different solutions. So to give you just some idea, the Big Island of Hawaii, which has I want to say about 180,000 people, has 200 megawatts. So it's about 200 megawatts of demand. And on the Big Island, we're one of the better off because we have lots of space for solar, we have lots of wind, and we have geothermal. So those three should be able to do the job. With geothermal is baseload, by the way. So if you have geothermal anywhere, geothermal will produce electricity 24/7 and without any variability. So that is how can I say, that's my favorite of all of the renewable energies because it's got the smallest footprint. And you know, the problem with solar, as was mentioned, takes up lots of land. Now we say, you know, land is useless if it's not ag land, but land used to be, you know, forest and places for animals to live, nature space. And if we just cover all of the nature space with solar panels, then we're losing something in the translation. I went to Okinawa. This is very interesting. I went to Okinawa and talked to the leaders of the, how can I say, the renewable energy movement in Okinawa. And I asked them, so how does Okinawa get its electricity? It's coal. Where do you get your coal? It's Australia. Is the price of coal going down? No, it's going up. Well, what about solar? It's expensive. Is it getting more expensive? No, it's getting cheaper. Why is it expensive? Well, we don't have many people who know how to do it, so it's expensive. Why are you not switching? Because they all have concrete, they all live in concrete houses because of hurricanes. They all have roof space, and almost none have rooftop solar. Why don't you do more of that? You know, the electricity is relatively cheap. So how does it get to be cheap if you how does it get to be cheap if the price of coal is going up? So, well, Tokyo decides the price of our electricity. Tokyo decides the price of your electricity. So that means Tokyo is subsidizing the coal. Yes. Is there nobody who knows math in Tokyo? It doesn't make any sense. And then they said, we did a study, and this is the interesting part, is if we covered 1% of the land area of Okinawa with solar, it would be enough to power all of Okinawa. 1%. I said, well, why don't you do that? Well, it's a decision made in Tokyo. Anyway, politics gets in the way. So then I'd like to talk a little bit about the grid and what's going on in Europe, because I went to Europe last year and visited my cousin, and he was telling me all about how in the daytime, the price of electricity goes down to sometimes zero or sometimes negative. They'll pay you to take it. What's going on there? What's going on is that they have so much solar adopted that, and people get to feed into the grid. The way it works is every 15 minutes, the price of electricity changes. And so there's times at night or in the evening when it's really expensive and times in the daytime when it's super cheap, which gives an opportunity for people on a private level to buy electricity in the daytime when it's cheap or negative and sell it in the evening when it's expensive. This is called arbitrage. And it's set up this way. You need a smart grid. And so Europe's already bitten off the thing about making a smart grid, which we absolutely need to do. If we had the same system of buying and selling electricity, you find people setting up energy storage facilities to buy electricity when it's cheap and sell it when it's expensive. And that would even out how can I say, the that would even out the load on the grid. So that's Europe. So in Hawaii, as a state, we're at 36% renewable energy. Kauai is probably the way ahead. They're at like 70 something percent. They're going to go 100% in a couple of years, which just shows that it can be done. I mean, they went from doing diesel to 100% renewable, and we're watching these things happening under our nose. The reason that Kauai is so far ahead of the rest is they're a co-op. They're different from the utility. The utility, HECO or HELCO, governs all the other islands, all the other islands besides Kauai. And well, having changed the business model of the utility has really made the utility our friend. And so we're on the same page. Now, how does Oahu or any place that has lots and lots of residential and the problem of increasing the amount of electricity that's needed at the end of the line. So what, we talked about infrastructure earlier. One way of looking at it is that we need way more wire and upgraded wire, smart wire, to connect all of the existing users. And this is going to cause a huge amount of money. And it's going to have to happen. And the electric companies are trying to figure out how can we put that off. And the way to put it off is by having storage at the end of the line. That's a virtual power plant. And it's a business that I'm getting into. The virtual power plant says that we have batteries hopefully in every home. And then when there's too much electricity on the grid, we tell all those batteries to charge. And when there's not enough electricity on the grid, then we tell them to discharge. And because the batteries are at the end of the line, they don't have far to go to where the demand is. We talked also about how much lost in electricity when it's being transmitted over long distances. Well, if you have a neighborhood and you store the energy in the neighborhood, and then you how can I say, use it when you need it from that neighborhood, it doesn't have very far to go. So it's a very efficient way of improving the situation in neighborhoods. And I think there are 5 utilities that are already doing this today, including the one in Hawaii. The bottleneck has been and is how much time or labor it takes to install those batteries. And so that's the major pain point. There's only so many electricians. And so we have been working on figuring out how to decrease the amount of time and decrease the skill level of the person installing the batteries. So traditional batteries like a Tesla Powerwall takes 2 guys something like 12 hours to install. It's not just a battery, but it's several other boxes that need to be installed. And the main battery weighs over 250 pounds. So it's not something that one person can handle. And the battery system that we've come up with starts with an empty box, and all the components are clipped in the way you clip in a battery onto your bicycle, onto your electric bicycle. So that has reduced it from 2 guys working 12 hours to one guy working 1 to 2 hours. That should increase or improve the situation on the labor side. And the installation normally, because you're doing pipes and wiring in the pipes, that requires skilled labor. Ours is just one connection point. And so the amount of labor that's involved, skilled labor involved, is much less. So hopefully that's going to make a dent in it. And it's certainly going to be a big business, or I predict this is going to be a big business going forward, which is why I'm in this business now.
So, Hank, one of the things tying this sort of backwards, as I said at the beginning, I would want to do is you're putting storage at the end of the line. And as you pointed out with Hawaii, at first they wanted to buy all your power, then they didn't want to buy any power. So obviously no one's going to start a business, whether it be on your house or a company, where the buyer isn't reliable. And this has happened in many cases. It's happened in California, where they were buying back power and then suddenly they're buying it at a tenth. Connecticut is the opposite, where they will buy power at exactly the same rate that they sell it to us because they're so desperate. But the day when they're not desperate, well, then what? So, Rob, 1 second. So essentially, the storage that Stephen talked about is grid storage. Although, Hank, you alluded to pump storage. Pump storage is just hydro. You pump it to up a mountain and drain it down during the day. And that's the largest storage system in the United States. The utilities use it, have it, and it's only used for balancing fossil fuel. And now it needs to be used for all alternatives. Yeah, before we roll on, Rob, what's on your mind?
Thanks, Andy. Just a quick question for Hank. And if the gentleman from Canada wants to chime in, that's fine. Hank, you mentioned the Japanese have a either some sort of reimbursement mechanism. There's something there that keeps the tariff lower. I've also I'm familiar with Germany being very active with respect to solar. How long do these, call it national reimbursements, how long of a policy does that go, and what are your thoughts on how private sector plays on an equal field to that when there is, reimbursement or incentive, and some don't have that?
Yeah, well, this comes in. This fits into the $7 trillion of subsidies that we feed into the into the fossil fuel industry. Subsidies don't just, they're not generally direct. Okinawa is a special case because, we have our bases in Okinawa. And so Japan gets a lot of money from hosting our bases there. And there's of course a lot of, how can I say, public pressure to get rid of the bases. They don't like them to be there. And to placate the public pressure, they've, how can I say, they subsidize the electricity. That's what's going on there. So it's not so much a temporary thing. It could be temporary when things get really, really, how can I say, stupid, if coal were to go up even more, or if solar, somebody came up and said, we can do that for you without having to have all that coal. I don't know the answer. This is a politics issue in Tokyo on the Japan side. It's not very clever, if you ask me.
Actually,
thank you.
Was that?
I have one thing I'm going to throw up. Give me a second here, because I've got to do two at once. Apologize. I had this all set up and it crapped out just as the thing started. So Hank was talking about the prices in Europe and coal. This is natural gas. Remember my first chart where natural gas is the one fossil fuel you can throttle up and down. So you can make turbines go up and down, but not instantaneously. So here's the peak in 22. And I didn't have time to overlay this with electricity prices, but I don't know where you are. My electricity prices doubled during this period, and they've halved again. And I think in Stephen's part of it, we were talking about, or he was talking about, projects where natural gas, or someone was asking a question, natural gas not being funded. So you can see what happens is you have this peaks and valleys. So the answer to the question is the marginal cost of the last bit of electricity drives the whole price, not the nuclear, not the hydro, what that last kilowatt hour cost. And it's driven by natural gas at the moment, not by wind and solar because they're not big enough. And that variability and storage and stability of the grid is what this whole conversation is about. So just take natural gas and pretend it's electricity prices, and that's what it's looked like over the last 5 years. So I wanted to throw that in as kind of an answer. Zara?
Yes, hi. So I had a question. Hank, you mentioned the smart wire, and also some of the copper was mentioned by Stephen. What do you mean exactly by smart wire? What should be different, for example, from the current copper wire productions to make it more a product of the future?
No, I meant smart grid.
A smart grid.
Smart
Okay.
grid. Yeah. So what smart grid does is it basically knows at the consumer level what, you know, each house, it knows how much is being used. If you go to a typical house in Hawaii, it's got one of those round boxes with a spinning wheel inside. And that spinning wheel tells you how much is being used at any given time. But there's a human being that goes to that house and checks what the number is at the end of the month, so they know how much to charge you. They don't know what time of day that you're using the electricity. If they knew that, then they could like give you an incentive to do your laundry during the day, for example, or whatever, to consume it during the day. If you've got a time of day use case where it's cheaper during the day, then that's when you charge your car. And so that changes the behavior of people. So that's a smart grid. That's
Colorado actually has that, and believe it or not, an army base that has a pump storage system. So they buy their electricity at night when it's cheap. They pump it up the mountain, and they don't use the grid during the day. So that's what Hank's talking about. But it's here and there. It's coming, but it's got a long way to go. So Michael Hammer.
It's engineering. We have to engineer all of this.
I was going to say we have it, but we just don't use it in most places. Michael Hammer.
So Andrew, to your comments about natural gas, which is in a sense near and dear to my heart because the farm we own is in the sweet spot of the Utica Shale. One thing people need to understand when they look at that chart is that is the spot market. In a very high percentage of natural gas production is actually contracted long-term.
I was just trying to make a point, and yes, the power, my utility buys its electricity in advance, and you can set up a system with them, but ultimately those contracts do run out and it flows back in. And my point, Michael, was you're absolutely correct. I said the marginal price, meaning that last bid, the marginal price of oil in the world is easier to understand. The most expensive barrel of oil in the world determines the price that trades on the exchange. That doesn't mean everybody's paying that price, obviously. But ultimately, over time, if the price were to remain high, that would be it. Carolina?
Okay, hopefully everyone can see me. I've tried, sorry, hear me, yes. So I have, we've touched, can you hear me? Sorry, can you just?
We can hear you.
Yes.
So we've touched on a lot of points, and I try to streamline my thoughts as much as possible, yeah? So I think what we didn't discuss is the scales. So the scales of the solutions we are looking at. So at some point we've talked about the smaller scales where we see two trends like in Europe, decentralization. So microgrids, power plants operating on a singular plant, which we see a lot of that. Digitization, so we have the trading, but I think it's a little bit in its infancy at the moment. But at the same time, we're looking at the larger scale, right? Where everyone has a very ambitious net zero targets, which means that the mix of global energy supplies is changing. We also have high-end energy security problems, obviously around imports of oil and gas, and that are affecting the price that you showed, Andrew. And then we have a little bit of a weaker economic growth caused by different turmoils. So what you were saying is with those scales, right? We're trying to rebuild the grid. We're looking at what's going to happen 10 years from now and how are we going to rebuild it. There's some smaller initiatives and a bigger scale look. So I think what you've showed, Andrew, in the beginning was like, how do we replace the baseline supply from stable resources like gas and coal and ensure grid stability with the new renewable resources that perhaps at the moment are unable to cope with the grid, or the grid is not there, or the resource percentage is not there to supply that. And I've looked into this on a wider scale, which means managing the solution with batteries. And again, here you have to look at scales as well. So batteries can manage hourly, daily, weekly, or seasonal loads. Depends again on the scale you're looking. If you're looking as a government on the entire country, you have to manage seasonal battery storage, so pumped hydro, for example. If you're looking at a smaller local scale, you have to look at smaller batteries. And I guess taking all that into consideration, my question to you would be like, which way do you think and how fast? Because my view is at the moment we're not ready. We don't have the technologies to make the change. How fast do you think this transition will happen? And how do you think, like, for instance, the American grid will look like in 10 years from now? What is the most probable scenario? Sorry, a little bit long. Yeah.
The first question, we'll get the how long part for a second. The first question was about scale. The answer is all of the above. The answer is Hank putting stuff in people's houses, which, by the way, builds up.